key out. Should it come out first or should it come out last? Should agricultural soils be included in this category? WRB has anthrosols and it has technosols. Should we add two soil orders, or should we combine them into one? Should we classify contaminated land? In other words, should anybody classify contaminated land, or should we simply draw a line around it and say contaminated, or not even identify what's inside that line on the soil map? And then how do you define contamination? Should litter and debris artifacts be criteria for a new soil order, or only intentionally placed artifacts? Should excavated soils be classified in the new soil order? Excavated soils. And do we need to redefine even what soil is? Should sealed surfaces and rooftops be considered soil? These were all questions that we considered. Here's an example of a deep excavation. Should the material on the road banks on either side here be called soils, or should we classify them in the new soil order? So all of these were questions we had to ask. Well, we began by coming up with a name, and we used from Artifactum, which means made with skill, something made with skill. And the soils either contain artifacts or they were designed by humans for a purpose. Soil was placed there by a purpose. There was some intentional effort there. And the formative element for the new soil order will be art. So we will not use existing names if our definition's fundamentally different, and that's why we did not call it anthrosols or technosols, because those names are taken and the definitions are already defined. Since our definitions did not match, we used a different name. The soil is made with skill. It was designed for a purpose, and that purpose was to put a pipeline there and then to cover it up and revegetate it. Artisols, then. A new soil order for most human transported materials and some human altered materials, but not all. And why did we find the need for a new soil order? Well, we felt it was justified because artifacts have variable weathering potential, and substances from anthropogenic activities and some byproducts of anthropogenic activities are unique, and some are potentially hazardous, and that's important for human use of the soil. Interpretations for soils that are weathering artifacts have not been developed, and we needed to develop those interpretations. Many areas are unmapped. How can we advise people if we have no soil map and no soil series and no soil taxa? Internal structure of the soil, water movement through soils. Engineers asked us questions about the strength of these materials, the subsidence and liquefaction potential of the soils, and they're variable, but we can't give them information if we could not classify and then map. And soil quality functions and services, fertility and carbon storage are highly altered in these soils. And so improved classification was needed to facilitate research studies and then development of interpretations. Where would these soils occur? I think most of us immediately think of urban areas, but consider also transportation corridors. We spent a large amount of time in the last week driving over anthropogenic soils. Every single time the roadbed was raised above the surface, it was built on human transported material. Every railroad track was built on human transported material. We saw a mine spoil area. It was human transported. Pipeline corridors, graveyards, construction sites, airports, etc., levees and dams, archaeological sites, and other anthropogenic landforms. And so this covers not just the urban area, but also in the remote rural areas as well. And what soils would be included in the new order then? Soils with high amounts of artifacts in one or more layers, paved areas, but narrowly paved areas, not expansive parking lots, but narrow areas so that the area underneath the pavement or sealed surface can be utilized by plant roots. It can exchange water, it can exchange air, and it can support plant life, higher plant life, as well as microbial life. And so we set a limit of 3 meters wide or narrower. Areas with manufactured layers, such as a geomembrane. Areas that have been excavated and then replaced, such as pipeline trench. Human transported material that's 30 centimeters or more thick that has a sulfuric horizon or sulfidic materials. And if it doesn't, then it needs to be 50 centimeters thick. And then contaminated soils. So those would be included. Here's a picture of humans transporting soil and altering the landscape. Here's an example of the excavated and replaced soils after they fill this trench. This would be a human-altered material. Human transported materials. This can be garbage dumps. This can be construction debris, or it can be a large anthropogenic landform such as the Hong Kong airport, which is over 90% human transported material. There was only just a few small islands that were connected. That's a massive amount of human transported material. We have contaminated soils. Some of you saw these soils just the other day. But what soils are not included in the new soil order? Humans certainly have modified agricultural soils worldwide. In fact, indirectly, we've modified every square centimeter of the Earth's surface, whether it's through modifying the atmosphere or direct or radioactive fallout that occurred worldwide. So we had to draw the line somewhere. And so we said that standard agricultural soils and soils with just superficial disturbance are not included. So cornfields are not included. Soils with conservation terraces are not included. The agricultural soils were not included in our system because we knew we needed to provide details to users that were more specific than we could provide in the new soil order. So in order to maintain our ability to advise farmers, foresters, and other people that were using the soil intensively to grow things, we kept those in the existing soil orders that they're in now. And then soils with collateral modifications we excluded. So in other words, eroded mollisols. Humans certainly played a role in losing and eroding complete mollic epipedons off of shoulder positions in long-term agricultural areas. But we did not feel like we could classify those consistently, so we left them in their purpose. Okay. We also did not include in the new soil order the deeply excavated areas, unless the material was replaced. We can classify soil that we see. It's hard to classify soil that is no longer present. The deep plowed and terrace soils are not included again because we need that specificity of them. There's no doubt that this landscape that you're looking at is highly modified by humans. It has cut and fill, but it's also intensively managed for agriculture. And then we didn't include things that are not soils. So miscellaneous land types. So think back to that pavement. Let's go to a sidewalk. The sidewalk that is 2 meters wide has roots underneath it. We're going to call that an ecranic sealed surface, and could classify the soil underneath it. But what about a parking lot that is 50 meters wide with no plants growing in it, utilizing it? We're going to call that a miscellaneous land type and not classify it as soil. Rooftops that are not connected to another land surface. The sediment that's still mobile and still moving, and areas not capable of supporting higher plants unless humans intervene, will not be classified. So that would include like a rooftop that may have some algae growing on it or some lichens on the rooftop we don't consider that soil at this point. So we needed some new diagnostic horizons. So one is the Artifactic Horizon. and simply a mineral soil material. It could be organic too. I guess I need to modify that a bit. I just have never seen artifacts in an organic deposit yet, but maybe they exist. But we needed 15 centimeters or more thickness and 10% or more by volume or weight of artifacts. Now, we excluded that, so these soil artifacts need to be in the soil, and the 10% criteria was based on a research study. Okay, and then the principles related to hazard potential. In general, the principle is the greater the percent of noxious artifacts, the greater the hazard potential. But it's also proximity to the surface. If I have a large amount of noxious artifacts that are buried 3 meters down in the soil, I'm not that concerned about it. I'm pretty well insulated from that. What if that material that contains 30% noxious artifacts is actually at the soil surface? Now I'm very aware of the hazard potential. We simply copied the definition of the acranic layer from WRB. We like it. What we excluded was vertical walls are excluded in our definition of acranic manufactured layer. Then we defined hazic materials. This is difficult, and this is still a work in progress. I value your comments and your suggestions on how to improve our definitions. But at this point, we are relying on federal and state agencies whose job it is to follow their published standards, their published limits, and to make the determination. And that is simply because of a liability potential. And so our soil scientists will simply take areas identified by these federal agencies whose job it is to identify these materials, and we will draw soils lines around them on the soil map. Now we added an epipedon. We modified the anthropic epipedon, and we again adopted the Predic. We call it an epipedon, but a Predic Horizon from WRB and the Plagan Horizon from WRB. So we use the WRB definition of those materials. And within the new soil order, any one of these epipedons can exist. In our feeling is none are excluded. And in fact, the anthropic epipedon can be used in other soil orders besides just the artisols. Well, how do we define artisols then? They're going to key out first. And these are the criteria that we have in our draft at this point. It's up for vote at this point in the United States. We either have an artifactic horizon or hazic materials in a layer 15 centimeters or thick or more thick, an acranic layer at the surface or in the subsurface. A manufactured layer, and those would be the ones in the subsurface. The acranic layer will come out here in a minute. Human altered material produced by excavation and replacement at least 50 centimeters deep. The human transported materials, as mentioned earlier, thinner if they contain a very hazardous material, thicker if they are cleaner material. And if they're compacted intentionally by humans, they don't have to be as thick. And then the acranic layer would be that manufactured layer that exists at the top. The suborders that we would consider would be first those that are underwater. And these are listed in sequence of most restrictive land use choices or the most limiting land use choices. So underwater seems like it's extremely limited. What can you do with soil that's underwater? Hazardous material would come out second. Soils with permafrost would come out third because of the extreme interpretation limitations of soils with permafrost. Then soils that are wet near the surface, then those that contain a significant amount of artifacts, and then others that are clean fill materials. So we defined some new names. You'll recognize many of these names. So GARBI for garbage, HUMI for elevated levels of organic carbon, MANU for manufactured materials. These would largely be landfills. PORTI would be transported, radioactive material, rest from restored. So these would be the excavated and replaced areas or reclaimed mine soils. Sulfi for having either sulfuric or sulfidic materials, and WASTI for having manufacturing waste. So this would be tailing, pits, polluted or contaminated soil material. We have 24 proposed grade groups. So across the top of this table, you'll see the 6 proposed suborders, and within each column will be the proposed grade groups. We already have existing soil series set up. There are 75 soil series already set up for these types of soils. So we have, of that chart that you saw, we have already populated about half of those taxa with existing soil series. So within the underwater soils, we have those that contain significant amounts of sulfides, those that are very, very sandy, and then the others, the ones that are loamy and clayey and organic. Within the hazards, we're only going to go down to the grade group level, and that would be those that have radioactive materials and then all others. We're not encouraging people. We did not develop subgroups of these grade groups on purpose. We do not want to classify them to great detail, although a private consultant may choose to provide that information, but the federal government will not be providing that kind of specific information to the users. In all other groups, we will. So for those with permafrost, and you can see a highway that's been deformed as the permafrost is thawing. Those that contain noxious artifacts, those that contain garbage, those that contain artifacts that are not garbage or hazardous, and then other gel arts. The picture at the bottom is taken from Antarctica, so these soils occur worldwide. With the wet soils, we will have those again that contain either sulfidic materials or a sulfuric horizon. Those that are extremely sandy, those that have a perched water table and are dry underneath versus those that have a rising groundwater table. With the soils that have artifacts, we will separate the ones that contain noxious artifacts from manufacturing waste. Those that contain garbage, these would be unlined landfills. They occur worldwide in all climates, in all temperature regimes. The manufactureds would be the lined landfills because the land use recommendations would be extremely different from those with a geotech